The sun was already high above the dusty little western town, its golden light pouring over the clapboard buildings and wooden fences. But there was no warmth in the way the townsfolk carried themselves. Life in this place was hard, but harder still for anyone without power, money, or a strong family name to shield them from cruelty. And no one in town knew that truth better than Clara, the widow who had lost everything when her husband passed away the year before. Once she had been respected as the wife of a decent man, who had worked tirelessly in the stables and small fields they owned. But since his death, she had been reduced to little more than a target of scorn. Where once the townspeople offered polite smiles, now there were only jeers, whispers, and mockery behind her back. Some days, the cruelty didn't stop at words, it turned to shoves, to spilt baskets of food, to bruises left on her arms as she tried to defend herself. Clara lived at the edge of town in a small cabin that was falling apart, faster than she could repair it. Every morning she walked into the heart of town to try to sell the little she managed to produce from her patch of land, eggs from her half-starved hens, or sometimes bread she baked late into the night, though even flour was scarce for her. And every morning, the same people who once treated her kindly now treated her as though she was nothing but a burden on the earth. The storekeeper shorted her coins, the blacksmith's son mocked her torn dress, and women who once shared gossip over tea now turned their backs. Children hurled stones when they thought no one was looking. And yet, Clara bore it all, because she had no choice. She had to survive. Still, there was someone watching, a man who stood apart from the rest of the town, not because he wasn't welcome, but because he had built a life so vast, so wealthy, that he didn't need to lean on the petty cruelty of others. Ethan Cole, the rancher whose sprawling lands stretched further than most men had ridden in a day, was a figure of both respect and distance. He came into town rarely, usually for supplies or brief business meetings, and when he did, people treated him with a wary admiration. He was strong, broad-shouldered, his face weathered by sun and wind, and his wealth was the kind that made men lower their voices and women straighten their posture. But Ethan had little to do with the day-to-day lives of the townsfolk. He stayed on his ranch, commanding dozens of men, raising cattle, and quietly carrying the weight of his own solitary existence. On one particular afternoon, the moment that would change Clara's life began the same as all the others. She had gathered what little eggs she had collected and walked into town, her basket carefully balanced against her hip. The townsfolk noticed her immediately, as they always did. Some muttered under their breath, some laughed aloud. As she tried to make her way to the general store, a group of men sitting idly outside the saloon called out to her. "Hey, widow," one sneered, still trying to sell them rotten eggs. "Best thing you could do is give up and let the rest of us put your land to good use." His words were followed by cruel laughter, the kind that cut deeper than any blade. Clara clenched her jaw, fighting the sting of tears. She couldn't show weakness, not here, not in front of them. But when she reached the store, the cruelty didn't stop. The shopkeeper examined her eggs with exaggerated disgust, tossed one aside so it cracked against the counter, and offered her only half the coin they were worth. Clara protested softly, but he only leaned closer, his tone turning sharp. "Take it or leave it, widow. You'll find no charity here." With no choice, she accepted the meager pay, her shoulders heavy with the humiliation of being cheated once again. What Clara didn't know was that across the street, leaning casually against the rail outside the saloon, Ethan Cole had been watching. He had seen this scene play out many times before. He had seen the bruises on Clara's arms, the way she walked with her head slightly bowed, the way her once bright eyes had grown dim with suffering. For months, he had told himself it wasn't his business. A man couldn't solve every wrong in the world, and he had his ranch to manage. But that afternoon, as the sun slanted low and Clara stumbled out of the store with coins clutched in her trembling hand, Ethan felt a pull deep in his chest that told him he could no longer stand aside. And then, as if fate itself had decided the moment, the cruelty escalated. A group of rough young men blocked Clara's path, smirking as one of them snatched the basket from her arms and dumped the rest of the eggs into the dirt. "Oops," he drawled mockingly. "Guess your hens are as worthless as you are." The crowd laughed, and Clara dropped to her knees to salvage what she could. her hands shaking as she picked fragments of shell from the dust. Before she could rise, one of them shoved her shoulder, knocking her back down. The pain on her face was plain, but the greater wound was the humiliation, the knowledge that no one would step forward to help her. But this time, someone did. The crowd went silent as a tall figure strode across the street, his boots thudding against the wooden boards. Ethan Cole's shadow fell across the men, and his voice was calm but carried the weight of thunder. "Pick her basket up." For a moment, no one moved. The leader of the group scoffed nervously, trying to hold on to his bravado. "Now hold on, Mr. Cole, we were just—" Ethan's eyes narrowed, and his voice sharpened. "I said pick it up. Now." The young man swallowed hard, his face paling as he bent down and gathered the broken remains into the basket. He held it out to Clara, who stared up in shock, unable to understand why Ethan Cole, the richest rancher in the county, was suddenly standing beside her. With a trembling hand, she accepted the basket, though her eyes never left Ethan's face. He extended his hand, strong and steady, and helped her to her feet. The silence in the street was deafening. For the first time in months, Clara felt the weight of another's protection, and for the first time in years, Ethan Cole felt the stirrings of something he thought long buried, the need to shield, to care, and perhaps to love. The days following Ethan Cole's intervention rippled through the town like a storm, wine that no one could escape. People whispered in hushed tones on the wooden sidewalks, peering out from under their hats whenever the wealthy rancher rode through. It wasn't the first time Ethan had raised his voice in town, but it was the first time he had done so on behalf of someone as lowly, as powerless, as the widow Clara, and that single act had shifted something in the air. The men who had tormented Clara now kept their distance, though their sneers had only sharpened when they thought Ethan wasn't near. The women of the town gossiped more cruelly than ever, spinning tales about why a man like Ethan would lower himself to defend her. Some claimed she had bewitched him, others that she was scheming for his wealth. Every word of venom reached Clara's ears eventually, carried on the careless tongues of children or muttered loud, enough for her to hear as she passed. Clara herself didn't know what to make of it. That day on the street played again and again in her mind, the towering figure of Ethan Cole, standing over her tormentors, his hand reaching down to lift her from the dirt. She could still feel the strength of his grip, the steadiness that had steadied her heart when everything else had seemed to crumble. But she was not foolish. She knew men of power acted for their own reasons, and whatever kindness Ethan had shown, she dared not believe it meant more than a passing moment of pity. Her pride, though battered, would not let her imagine that a man like him would ever see her as more than the broken woman she had become. Yet Ethan could not shake the sight of Clara either. Her eyes, tired but still burning with a quiet resilience, haunted him even as he returned to his sprawling ranch. He tried to throw himself into work, riding the pastures, giving orders to his men, tallying the heads of cattle grazing under the wide sky. But no matter how far he rode, the memory of her remained. He had seen suffering before, cowhands injured, men beaten in saloon fights, women widowed by hardship, but there was something about Clara's suffering that struck him deeper. It was the injustice of it, the sheer cruelty of a town that chose to break the weakest rather than lend them a hand. And maybe, just maybe, it was the way she had refused to completely bow, even as she knelt in the dirt. That resilience called to him, a flame refusing to die. So when he rode into town again a week later, he sought her out. He found her outside the general store, clutching a small bag of flour she had bought with what little coin she had earned. The shopkeeper had once again shorted her. Ethan could see it in her downcast expression. He dismounted his horse, his boots stirring dust as he crossed to her. Clara startled when she saw him, her first instinct to lower her eyes. "Mr. Cole," she murmured softly, "I thank you for what you did the other day, but I don't want any more trouble on my account." Ethan studied her face, the way she tried to make herself small, invisible, even though her spirit begged to be seen. "Trouble's already here, Clara," he said firmly, his deep voice carrying the weight of truth. "You don't deserve what this town's done to you, and I'm not the kind of man who can watch injustice and keep his hands clean." Her breath caught at his words. No one had spoken on her behalf in so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to be defended. But fear lingered too. "They'll turn against you," she whispered. "They'll say things. "Let them," Ethan interrupted. "I've faced worse men than these, and I've got no need for their approval. What matters is that you stop carrying this burden alone." Clara's heart thudded painfully in her chest. She wanted to believe him, wanted to lean on the strength he offered. But years of pain had taught her caution. She gave him only a small nod, and with that, Ethan did not press further. But he knew in his soul that he was not finished. This woman, this widow the town had trampled into the dirt, deserved far more than scraps of pity. She deserved safety, dignity, and maybe, if fate allowed it, love. That night, back at his ranch, Ethan sat long by the fire, staring into the flames as though they might reveal the future. He thought of his wealth, his vast lands, the power he wielded. None of it had brought him peace. None of it had filled the emptiness in his chest. But when he thought of Clara, bruised but unbroken, he felt something stir a purpose that had been missing for too long. Slowly, he began to realize that protecting her was not just an act of kindness. It was a choice that would define the kind of man he was. The weeks that followed were not kind. Word of Ethan's defense of Clara had spread beyond the town, and into every ranch and farmstead for miles. To some, it was a sign that Ethan Cole had finally grown soft, that the mighty rancher who had built an empire on discipline and distance had been undone by a widow's sorrowful eyes. To others, it was a threat if Ethan sided with the weak. Then the petty cruelty by which the town maintained its order might crumble, and no one liked change. Clara bore the brunt of this storm, though Ethan's presence kept the cruelest men at bay. The whispers only grew sharper. Women crossed the street rather than walk beside her. Storekeepers slammed goods on the counter, muttering that she had bewitched the richest man alive. Even children, repeating the poison of their parents, spat insults when she passed. Every day, Clara wrestled with shame and fear, and every day, she wondered if Ethan would tire of shielding her. But Ethan was not a man who tired easily. When the town's malice threatened to consume her, he rode to her cabin at the edge of the woods and offered his protection in the form of quiet companionship. Sometimes he brought supplies from his ranch flour, fresh beef, even warm blankets stitched by his housekeeper. Sometimes he simply sat on her porch as the sun sank low, speaking little, his presence alone enough to steady her shaking heart. Clara resisted at first, her pride refusing to accept charity. But slowly she began to understand that Ethan was not offering her charity at all. He was offering her respect, a respect she had not known in a long, long time. Still, the town would not let them be. One bitter evening, just as winter's breath swept across the plains, Clara woke to the smell of smoke. Her heart pounded as she rushed outside to find flames licking up the side of her cabin. She cried out in terror, grabbing buckets of water, but the fire was too strong. Shadows fled into the darkness. Cowards who had lit the blaze and vanished. Clara's sobs echoed in the night as her world threatened to collapse. But then hooves thundered against the dirt, and Ethan was there. He leapt from his horse, tearing off his coat, beating at the flames, shouting orders as his ranch hands, who had followed him, formed a line to douse the fire. By dawn, the cabin was charred but still standing. Clara sat trembling on the ground, her face streaked with ash and tears, when Ethan knelt beside her. His hand brushed the soot from her cheek, and his voice was steady. "This ends now," he said. "No one will drive you from this land. No one will touch what's yours. Not while I draw breath." The fire had not only scorched her home, it had burned away the last barrier between them. For Clara, the truth was laid bare. Ethan was not simply a wealthy rancher pitying a poor widow. He was a man who saw her worth even when others spat on it. A man willing to stand in the flames beside her. And for Ethan, the decision he had wrestled with for weeks became clear. His wealth, his land, his reputation, none of it meant anything if he allowed this woman to be destroyed before his eyes. He had built an empire alone, but perhaps it was time he built a life with someone who gave him purpose. So it was that a week later, on the steps of the church at the heart of town, Ethan Cole made his stand. Clara stood at his side, her hands trembling in her worn dress, while the townsfolk gathered in stunned silence. Whispers ran like wildfire, disbelief in every face. Ethan's voice, deep and unyielding, cut through the air. "You all know me," he said. "You know what I've built, what I've fought for, and you've all seen how you treated this woman, how you tried to break her because she had no one left. Well, she has someone now. She has me, and I'll not see another day where she's cast aside. From this day forward, Clara is mine, not as a burden, not as charity, but as my bride. Gasps rippled through the crowd, but Ethan's gaze never wavered. He turned to Clara, and in that moment, she saw not just the wealthy rancher the world admired, but the man who had reached into the dust to lift her up. Her eyes filled with tears, not of sorrow, but of gratitude and love long denied. She nodded, and the preacher, too astonished to protest, spoke the words that bound them. The town could whisper all it liked, could stew in envy and malice, but the truth was undeniable. Clara was no longer a beaten widow. She was the bride of Ethan Cole, and together, they would weather whatever storms came. For in each other, they had found something the world could not take away: dignity, courage, and love strong enough to defy an entire town. And as the bells tolled, Clara lifted her chin high for the first time in years. Her hand clasped in Ethan's. The widow who once knelt in the dust now stood tall at the side of the rancher, who had chosen her, not out of pity, but out of a love powerful enough to silence every cruel voice.